much for coming. I am really excited and honored to be standing with this amazing group of people here today to talk about a critically important bill, the Environmental Justice Bill, S.148, which is long overdue, as you'll hear from our speakers, and is a fundamental bill to ensure that every single person in Vermont has access to a clean, healthy environment, and that no person in Vermont is being unfairly burdened by pollution and other harm from the environment. So it's a basic right, a bill that is essential for Vermont, and I'm really excited to hear from leaders today, like Senator Kasia Rinsdale, who's going to kick us off and can speak more about the history and why this is so important. And we're going to hear from Representative Carrie Dolan, who's been leading on the House Natural Resources, Fish and Wildlife Committee, and Sebi Wu from VPERG, Elena Mahali from Conservation Law Foundation, and Dan Fingus from Rights and Democracy, who have been really working alongside these legislative champs to get this bill a strong, effective bill that's going to help all Vermonters into law. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Senator Kasia Rinsdale.
Good morning. So what we wanted to accomplish was a reflection during Earth Week, just post a Friday Earth Day, when we recognize that for so long, people of color and marginalized folks who care about the environment have been left out of the mainstream environmental movement. 30 years ago this year, the first National People of Color Environmental Summit took place. And it wasn't an opportunity to say we too want to be part of the mainstream environmental movement, but to say we have always been the environmental movement. We have been chaining ourselves to trees in India for over 100 years. We have been fighting for clean air and clean water since indigenous people were the ones who were the full caretakers of this land that we now stand on. We have been here caring for the earth, and this is our movement just as much as it's yours. And I hope we can reflect on that and celebrate this momentous Earth Week and Earth Month and Earth Day, and really every day should be Earth Day, but to recognize that Vermont is about to take a critical step forward in meeting that light at the crossroads between the environmental and social justice movement. We know we're poised, and you're going to hear more from Representative Carrie Dolan about this. We know we're poised to pass a strong environmental justice bill, to pass S.148 out of the House this week. And what that means and what that looks like is a decade-plus long process in Vermont of building stronger coalitions that center those who have often been at the margins. We have been working for 15 or more years to make sure that people who live in our mobile home communities, people who identify as indigenous, migrant farm workers, people who live in geographic isolation, folks in areas that have high asthma rates or high energy poverty, know that this is their movement too, and that this bill was written by and for them. And that's why it's been so critical, and we've been so appreciative as the bill moves through the legislature, that while it takes the normal course of process, and while we do our due diligence and in fact strengthen the bill, and I really want to thank some of the environmental leaders who are standing with us today for helping to strengthen the bill and borrow best practices from around the country, that we also recognize that when we define environmental costs and environmental benefits, we do it in a way that it has meaning for those who have been most left out of the environmental movement. And so when we have an administration, who's come into our committees and questioned, well, how do we make sure we are able to carry out this part of the definition, or how do we, make sure that we have enough staff support to do this work? We're trying to build a coalition that is much bigger than the folks in the State House to answer those questions. We're trying to make sure that those who are in tears because they can't figure out where to get information to help with flooding or where to go on a hot day to cool off, that they know exactly how government should help them and is going to help them. And that those situations happen less because we're getting resources to the communities that have been underinvested in for so long. That ties to what's happening at the federal level with so many new initiatives in our infrastructure bills to make sure communities that have been under-resourced and underinvested for so long are now front and center in the environmental movement, in our civil rights work, and in all of our policies. And this is a lens through which to look at the intersection of power, poverty, and pollution, and make sure that we're helping those who have been most left behind. So I thank you, and I'd like to turn it over to Representative Carrie Dolan. I just want to extend my appreciation to Representative Dolan, who's been an incredible champion as well. And it's hard for me, having worked on this for over a decade, to just hear what's happening in the House and not have as much influence on it, but that's why I'm so grateful to the House members we have here today, and particularly Representative Dolan for shepherding this through and continually improving the bill as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Kasia, and really thank you for the entire legislature, because this does take the legislature to really get this bill across the finish line. This bill is really about health and wellness, and to ensure that our communities across the state are healthy and have safe housing, safe environment for them to prosper. This is much about an economic development and redevelopment bill as it is a public health and environmental health bill. Right now it's in the House Natural Resources, Fish and Wildlife Committee. I'm really hopeful that we'll be voting the bill out of the committee and get it onto the floor. And it's a fantastic bill in that it for the first time lays into statute an environmental justice policy. It stands up an interagency committee to work together across state government to ensure that we're collaborating, we're coordinated, we're working together to address the needs of our communities across the state. It has, for the first time, an advisory committee made up of folks we haven't traditionally heard from, giving them a voice and participate in this process, and to enable them to weigh in and advise this interagency committee. We have seen, with respect to this interagency committee, we have seen firsthand what that can do when we're faced with crises. We look at Tropical Storm Irene and with the lessons learned from that. And when we brought state government together, working with communities, we were able to restore, recover better than we ever were. We integrated resiliency into our communities. What we also realized that we had some communities and some neighborhoods left behind. And here's the value of this program. It also enables us to create, for the first time, a mapping tool which helps us visualize what those environmental impacts are, what they look like across the landscape. How are we making our investments? Are we in fact addressing or investing in these communities so that they too can prosper along with the rest of the state? Just think of what we can accomplish with this interagency committee and with the input from this advisory committee. So I'm really thrilled about this bill. I'm thrilled to get it onto the floor, and I'm thrilled to see that in partnership with the executive branch, with our communities in particular, with voices that we haven't traditionally heard from, just think what we can accomplish for the health and well-being of Vermont.
What they said. I'm Sebi Wu, Climate and Equity Advocate at VPERG. It's really exciting to be here in these last few days of the legislative session as the legislature is considering several key bills that would make progress on climate and the environment. At least one is long overdue, enacting the state's first environmental justice law. As you've heard, Vermont is on the verge of doing just that, thanks in large part to the work of Vermonters from a diversity of backgrounds and perspectives over the years to build our state's environmental justice movement. And that includes Senator Rinsdale, Representative Dolan, and several other legislators who have taken the lead on this issue. Dozens of groups support the passage of S.148, as you've heard. That includes organizations that represent interests ranging from protecting our environment, agricultural systems, rural communities, and wildlife, to those working towards social and racial justice, food security, disability rights, affordable housing, health equity, and ending poverty, and faith in business groups, and so much more. That's because we all have a stake in getting environmental justice right here in the state of Vermont. For far too long, some Vermonters have suffered more environmental burdens while having access to fewer benefits. And oftentimes, these are the same folks who are left out of decision-making. S.148 begins to change that. The bill currently being considered by the House Natural Resources, Fish, and Wildlife Committee represents a key step towards ensuring no Vermonter is left behind in our work to address the climate crisis and deliver a healthy, habitable environment for all. Notably, the Environmental Justice Advisory Council that's created by the legislation will need more resources to effectively engage with their communities in this work. We urge the House to pass a strong version of S.148 that includes additional funding to set this council up for success. Thanks for your time and attention, and to all of those who have helped to build the environmental justice movement in Vermont. And I'll pass it off to Elena.
Thank you, Sebi. Good morning. My name is Elena Mahali. I'm the director of CLF Vermont. I'm so delighted to be here with these supporters of the bill. As you've heard, for too long, Vermonters of color and low-income Vermonters have borne a disproportionate share of environmental harms in this state. And at the same time, we know that these communities are oftentimes the least likely to get to take advantage of our clean and healthy environment. And so what S.148 does, our first environmental justice law, is help us begin to solve this critical environmental injustice issues that are happening in our state. It takes a first step at setting up a framework that, as you've heard, sets up a critical environmental advisory council, justice advisory council. It also sets up us to create an environmental justice mapping tool that will, as Representative Dolan pointed out, allow us to start to visualize which particular communities are overburdened and which are not necessarily benefiting from the same environmental benefits that we're doling out. This has been in the making for, as you've heard, over 10 years, and we are so delighted to be a part of it. It is incredibly great that the Senate passed it out with tripartisan support, and we really hope that the House too comes out just as supportive of this bill. So thank you for your time, and I'm sure that we can open it up for questions. Or Dan, we can.
Hey everybody, my name is Dan Fingus. I'm the Movement Politics Director at Right to Democracy. I think the first thing I want to do is really, and I know we've said it before, but we have to thank Senator Rinsdale for her amazing work over 10 years to make this happen. I mean, I think she even got elected to Senate just to make sure that this actually happened, which is a lot of work to do for a really important bill. We also have to thank Senator Bray in the Senate Natural Resources Committee, who couldn't be with us this morning, obviously Representative Carrie Dolan, Representative Coach Christie with the Social Equity Caucus, who have put in a lot of hard work and attention into this. There's so many people who have done so much intentional, important work in this bill that it has to pass, and it has to pass in a meaningful way. Right now, we're seeing the real harms that are being done by the current climate crisis, and the harms that are being done by having the same people in the room over and over again making decisions about what happens to Vermonters. And people continually get left behind. Communities get left behind, neighborhoods get left behind. And this is the first step, maybe an important step, but only the first step towards making that right, towards creating a foundation for a just transition. And so we have to do that, we have to do it right. We have to do it in a way where these folks whose voices have not been in the room can actually afford to be in the room. And that means compensating them in a way that they can actually take time away from other jobs, away from their family to do this work. So we need to have a well-supported advisory council with this bill if we're going to be successful. And if we're going to actually not just replicate the unfair, unjust system that we already have. And so we don't want to have a hollow victory, we want to have a real victory, and that means a strong S.148. Thank you.
So yeah, now we'll open it up for questions. Folks have any? Yes.
The amount of funding for the bill has shrunk as it's worked its way through the process. I wonder how much funding is necessary for this bill, and particularly as it relates to staffing, because I understand there were more positions originally funded. What does it need to make it a strong bill?
Yeah, I'm looking at Representative Dolan. Do you want to take this?
Nothing is. The question was about funding, to support the bill. And we see this bill as an important first step. What came out from the Senate was a bill with reduced funding, and we're trying to use that and build upon that. And we'll see what, at the end of the day, what that will look like. But I'm hopeful that it will have adequate funding to get this bill going and to stand up the committees and the advisory council and begin this hard work.
Yeah, I would just add, you know, when we set out, we had an ambitious goal for what we could fund and what would be necessary. Everyone's had an ambitious goal for what needs to be funded this year. Mm-hmm. And when we look at the budget in full through an environmental justice lens, we need to make sure people have access to healthy, fresh food. We need to make sure people have housing that's habitable and safe. You know, we need to make sure people have adequate alternative transportation. And so all of those things are reflected in the budget, even if they're not right here in staffing these positions. Environmental justice has always been about looking at the entire picture and who's left behind. And I think with so many of our components of the budget, we've done a pretty good job of that in difficult times for Vermonters.
This bill, it seems like a really massive shift in terms of how the state views public policy, and it seems like you can touch a lot of areas, from economic development, housing, etc. How do we measure the success? And maybe it gets back to the mapping tool, but how do we measure and quantify the success of this policy 5, 10, 50 years out?
That is a great question, and the entire environmental justice movement has been built on how we measure success, whether it's by zip code or by household or, you know, by community. We have to look at geography, but we also have to look at occupational hazards. So are people who are working, you know, in the dairy industry suffering greater environmental harm or greater health disparities? You know, are people in mobile home communities suffering greater flooding vulnerability? I've often said, if you look at Tropical Storm Irene as one event, 8% of the state lived in mobile home communities at the time. They were 40% of the flooding victims. And then when you look at the disparity just in terms of who experienced flooding, you also then have to look at how did people recover? Who was left behind in an event like that might have affected a lot of people, but who didn't get the opportunity to be resourced in their recovery. So environmental justice has a lot of different ways that you can measure it, and all of those will hopefully influence positively our data collection in the state overall. We should know the demographic breakdown of who's experiencing health disparities. And we started to look at that in the pandemic, and we saw things that we were really concerned about. And we have to be as honest and aggressive in all of our data collection. This mapping tool is something that's fundamental from the federal government to every state that's enacted these kinds of policies, because you're not only looking at who is experiencing health disparities or a lack of environmental benefit, but how we get more of that infrastructure and those environmental benefits into more communities, whether it's solar panels or electric vehicle charging stations or other amenities that help people be part of a transition to a just green economy. Everyone has to benefit from that, and everyone has to be able to take part. Otherwise, we will be moving into a green economy that replicates the problems of our current gray economy. So, you know, it has, it's multifaceted. It's why it needs a lot of interagency cooperation and a mapping tool that we're really steadfast in ensuring is accurate and helping us distribute benefits in a different way than we have before.
I also just wanted to briefly ask about the advisory committee. How many people are on it? Who decides who's on it? You know, like what would their work look like? Just a few details on that.
I feel like that's a good house question because it's changed over.
Yes, and before I answer that, I just want to mention that the bill does call for a baseline study of investments coupled with the mapping tool. So that will help gauge our progress over time when we can compare our dollars invested, where they're going, for what purpose, and for what benefit and outcome. And so that will, I think, as I mentioned, together with the mapping tool, help guide our progress and our investments. With respect to your follow-up question, which was?
Just a little bit more about the advisory committee. Who's
yes.
on it?
Yes, thank you.
Appointed?
Yes, the House version of it, in recognizing that we were trying to find that that balance between the dollars available for us to support the advisory council and with attention towards the mapping tool. The House version has an advisor, is proposing an advisory council with 11 members. Those would be appointed by both the House and the Senate leadership. And it will represent those voices that we haven't traditionally heard from across a number of environmental justice or public health and environmental justice angles. They include representatives from, say, mobile home parks, for example, from communities that are, could be considered, at least in first blush, environmental justice focused communities. Other folks that perhaps can help bring to our attention some of the disparities that we already know exist and bring those to bear. There will be some representation of statewide organizations to help represent what rural environmental justice looks like, perhaps in the agricultural sector, for example. We have, I think, a representative from the Natural Resources Conservation Council through the Agency of Agriculture. We have a statewide, a representative from a statewide environmental justice-based organization, for example, and they can help provide some of that education and support for some of those voices we hope to hear from.
I'm curious, this is another question about the advisory council, but in terms of thinking about the role of that body, I'm curious, what is it going to take to make sure that that group isn't just having sort of performative say in shaping policy moving forward, and what would like an ideal outcome look like in terms of people getting to really shape future policies around climate, environment, and Vermont?
So one of the really critical definitions, both in the bill and in the way that civil rights legislation broadly works, is meaningful participation. Is that you change the process so that more people can participate and you're not holding all your meetings in the middle of the day in Montpelier. A really obvious way we'll be able to tell if this is working is that more Vermonters feel invested in environmental decision making, and they're able to access members of that advisory council, and that advisory council needs to have a clear link to the newly created Agency of Natural Resources Civil Rights Officer position. That position is currently half-time. And another element we're advocating around is that that needs to be a full-time position. I don't think ANR disagrees with us. It's simply a matter of finding the resources. That individual already has a massive job, even if they're a full-time civil rights officer. We're going to need to grow that office so that we can better measure our success in creating meaningful participation and in changing those metrics so that our mapping tool starts to show us that everyone has access to a clean and healthy place to live, a place for their kids to play that's near their home, a job that's not causing them more environmental harm, than benefit. And so as we build the measurement tools, there's going to be a lot of decision points that advisory council should be engaged in. What I think is also critical about your question is when we look around the country, there are advisory councils in every state that has an environmental justice bill. It's a best practice. There's also an environmental justice coalition outside of government holding government accountable to actually making that difference. And they need just as much access to data and information so they can meaningfully participate. And there may be disagreement around where policy lands, but there has to be that external pressure, and that is a really critical piece of a healthy ecosystem around environmental decision-making and participation.
Thank you.
I have one more if I could. You mentioned the administration had a couple of questions regarding the implementation of this policy. Where have you had any conversations with the governor and his staff? Where does he stand on this?
I know the Senate has heard from virtually every agency that is mentioned in this bill, and all of them have been interested and want to be part of this process. So that's truly exciting. We have the House have heard testimony from the Department of Health, and they've discovered that when you move upstream from looking at the data that shows morbidity and mortality and health outcomes, when you move upstream to determine and ask the question why is this occurring, what they're discovering is that much of that has to do with environment, and so how critical that is for the health and well-being of the public. And so of course the administration, like any administration, would be responsible. We can be interested in to understand how do we move forward with a budget that can support this work while at the same time be careful with the public's dollars. And so I think that's where the question is right now. But we've in our committee have heard those concerns, and the bill that we anticipate voting on today has modified some of the timelines so as to give the agencies more time, to allow for the process to work, to have the advisory committee, certainly council, certainly still have the folks participating in that advisory council selected, but allow for the necessary time to build trust among those members of that advisory council, as well as enable the agencies engaged to have the time necessary to work across the agencies, away from their silos, and work on, do the hard work. What the bill asks for is the development of a public engagement plan. And this is where agencies can work together to ensure consistency in that. And that input from that advisory committee council is going to help in informing what that public engagement plan will look like. So we want to make sure that there's adequate time to do this right.
I just want to put this in context that I believe the governor has as well. Vermont's first environmental justice grants from the EPA were received in 1999 for sewage backup and clean water issues in mobile home communities. That kicked off a broader look at what rural environmental injustice looks like in our state and other states that were a little bit further behind than some of our other counterparts in creating an environmental justice policy. We're now very far behind. That was 23 years ago, and we are now one of less than 10 states that doesn't have an environmental justice policy on the books. The EPA has been telling us since 2015 that that is not acceptable, and we need to be making good faith effort toward creating an environmental justice policy framework that's visible and actionable across state agencies. We also know that Maine is poised to pass an environmental justice policy this year as well. If there were to be an unraveling of the bill, or the bill were to be vetoed, that would put us back as the only state in New England that doesn't have an environmental justice policy, as we work within administration at the federal level that really would like to see investments go to communities that have been under-resourced. So the bigger picture here all adds up to us potentially leaving money on the table, or opening ourselves up to greater enforcement, or just being a real outlier left among all states, and particularly New England, in not having an environmental justice policy on the books. I hope the governor has that context. We've certainly tried to communicate that, and I think we are so far working in good faith to get a bill across the finish line and signed by the governor. Okay, if there are no more questions, we appreciate all the questions.